The story begins on a bleak morning, the kind where even the light seems hesitant to penetrate the heavy curtains of a grand estate. The air is thick with the scent of polished wood and faint decay, the subtle mingling of wealth and neglect. She arrives quietly, a young girl of barely 10, her small frame dressed in the stiff fineries of a child meant to impress, yet meant to conceal. There is a cold precision to the way she is presented, a meticulousness that underscores the sinister purpose behind her presence. She is not merely a child, she is a commodity, purchased for the gratification and status of 12 powerful men whose names command fear and reverence in the surrounding towns. From the very first moment, the disparity between her innocence and the intentions of her captors is stark. Each man regards her with a mix of entitlement and suspicion, their gazes sharp, calculating, and heavy with expectation. The estate itself seems to mirror this tension, its polished marble floors and towering ceilings reflecting the grandeur of authority while hiding the shadow of corruption in every corner. Servants move silently, glancing toward the girl with a mixture of pity and fear, sensing that the arrival of this fragile figure may set forces into motion that no one fully comprehends. The narrative paints the room in painstaking detail, the shimmer of gold-framed mirrors reflecting distorted images of the men, the oppressive weight of chandeliers that cast long, cold shadows across the room, and the quiet tick of clocks marking the relentless passage of time that seems indifferent to her plight. The girl's first impressions are equally nuanced. Though small and outwardly compliant, there is an acute awareness in her eyes, an instinctive understanding that she must read every expression, every movement, every silence. She perceives the subtle cracks in the facade of power surrounding her. One man, seated heavily in a carved chair, shifts in his seat with barely concealed irritation, while another fiddles nervously with a pocket watch, the rhythmic ticking emphasizing his impatience and unease. The way she watches them is almost imperceptible, yet it establishes a silent dialogue between observer and observed, a battle of perception that will quietly unfold over the years to come. The atmosphere is thickened by the history embedded in the estate itself. The halls are lined with portraits of ancestors whose stern faces seem to judge both her and the men, their painted eyes following each movement. This sense of legacy, of inherited authority, contrasts sharply with the girl's fragile presence, emphasizing the imbalance of power and foreshadowing the subtle ways she will disrupt the established order. The narrative lingers on minute details, the chill in the marble floors under her bare feet, the faint creak of a distant door as if the house itself is breathing, alive with secrets, and the whisper of fabric as the men adjust their coats or shift in their seats, unaware of how quickly their control may begin to slip. Psychologically, the section delves into the first ripples of the girl's emerging awareness. She understands the stakes not through spoken words, but through observation and instinct. Her mind maps the power dynamics at play, noting the subtle hierarchies among the 12 men, the fleeting glances that betray unease, and the unspoken rules that govern interactions within the estate. This is where the slow, methodical tension begins to take root, an innocent figure placed at the center of a storm she cannot yet name, yet one that she will navigate with a calculating patience. Her silence is both shield and weapon, her compliance a mask that hides the keen intelligence simmering beneath. Each man's initial reaction to her presence is subtly documented, revealing not only character but the seeds of their eventual unraveling. One displays impatience, snapping at a servant over a minor detail, exposing a brittle temperament. Another appears overtly polite, masking a simmering frustration that simmers beneath his composed exterior. Through these observations, the narrative establishes early contrasts between power and vulnerability, innocence and corruption, foreshadowing the way the girl will exploit these traits in the men over time. The cinematic perspective shifts between their perceptions and hers, creating a dual lens that immerses the audience in the psychological tension that defines the first encounter. The section also explores the moral and emotional implications of her position. Though she is treated as an object, the narrative does not shy away from her subjective experience, the quiet fear that lurks beneath her composed exterior, the flash of anger at being reduced to a commodity, and the simmering curiosity about the men who hold her fate in their hands. The tension is amplified through sensory details, the oppressive scent of fine cigars, the clatter of silverware on polished surfaces, the echo of footsteps in cavernous halls. These elements combine to create a cinematic environment where every detail, no matter how small, contributes to the foreboding atmosphere. Subtle signs of her resilience are already detectable. Small, almost imperceptible gestures, a steadying of her posture, a deliberate choice in her gaze, a quiet observation of mannerisms, hint at a mind that is already strategizing, even in the shadow of overwhelming power. The narrative emphasizes that while she may appear fragile, she is quietly assessing weaknesses, noting patterns, and building an internal map of influence. The audience begins to sense that she is not merely a passive participant. Her presence, though seemingly powerless, carries the latent potential to disrupt the fragile equilibrium of control maintained by the 12 men. The opening chapter closes by reinforcing the chilling duality of her situation. She is both exposed and unseen, vulnerable and calculating. The estate, the men, and even the servants are all portrayed as pieces in a larger psychological puzzle, with her as the unpredictable element at its center. The final paragraphs draw out the suspense through lingering, descriptive moments, the glint of light on a polished surface that mirrors her reflection, the hushed murmurs of unseen observers, and the subtle shifts in the men's behavior as they adjust to her presence. This establishes a slow-burning tension, setting the stage for the dramatic unraveling to follow, and leaving the audience with a profound sense of unease and anticipation. The girl's arrival is not just an intrusion into the walls of the estate but into a larger, carefully constructed world that exists beyond the gilded doors. The town surrounding the property is steeped in history, its streets and alleys lined with the remnants of centuries-old power and privilege. Cobblestone paths, uneven and worn from generations of foot traffic, reflect the sunlight in patches, yet shadows linger in every corner, concealing secrets that have long been ignored. Buildings, some grand and others crumbling, display the duality of wealth and decay, echoing the moral contradictions of the families who inhabit them. Markets bustle with ordinary townsfolk, but even in these moments of life, a subtle tension hums beneath the surface, the unspoken awareness that wealth and influence carry their own forms of menace. The estate itself sits at the edge of the town, perched on a gentle rise that grants the men both literal and symbolic dominance over the surrounding landscape. From the hilltop, the viewer can observe the meticulous layout of gardens, the carefully pruned hedges, and the ornamental fountains, all meant to signify control and refinement. Yet, there are imperfections, subtle signs of neglect, a crack in the marble, a fountain spout permanently clogged, ivy creeping over the stone, that hint at hidden flaws and the fragility of outward appearances. The narrative dwells on these contrasts, emphasizing how the town, though outwardly serene, mirrors the decay and duplicity that pervades the men's lives. Even nature seems complicit in the tension, gnarled trees twist like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long over the pathways, while mist from the nearby river coils over the streets in the early morning, blurring reality and rumor, giving the town an almost spectral quality. The town's history is carefully woven into the story, lending depth and resonance to the girl's intrusion. Founded generations ago by families whose names still command respect, it has been the site of both triumph and tragedy. The narrative describes past scandals and whispered crimes, tales of betrayal and vanished heirs, and local legends that speak of uncanny events around the estate. Each of these stories, while peripheral, establishes an atmosphere of latent unease. Locals speak in hushed tones about certain houses, certain families, and certain individuals, their conversations trailing off whenever they mention the 12 powerful men who now claim ownership of the girl. These legends are not presented as supernatural truths but as echoes of collective fear, shaping perceptions and behavior in ways that amplify the tension surrounding her presence. The social hierarchy of the town is as rigid as it is invisible. The narrative paints a detailed picture of the town's power structure, merchants who defer to landowners, clergy whose words carry weight far beyond their sanctuaries, and servants whose loyalty is bought as easily as their silence. Within this framework, the girl is positioned as an anomaly, a disruption to the carefully maintained order. She is both an outsider and an object of fascination, drawing the attention of the curious, the envious, and the fearful. Even the children of the town sense her difference, staring from the edges of the gardens or peering through cracks in the estate walls, sensing without understanding that her arrival will shift the balance of influence in subtle yet irrevocable ways. Through detailed observation, the narrative captures the sensory landscape of the town. The air carries the tang of the river, mixed with smoke from chimneys and the faint sweetness of flowers cultivated in private gardens. Bells from the town church toll at irregular intervals, marking both time and social ritual, and dogs bark intermittently, their sounds echoing against narrow alleys and empty courtyards. These elements are not merely decorative, they reinforce the psychological landscape in which the girl must navigate. The juxtaposition of ordinary life and hidden tension creates a cinematic environment where every glance, every sound, and every shadow carries potential significance. The section explores the town's response to her arrival, subtle yet telling. The local elite are aware of the girl's presence, though few have direct access to her. They whisper behind closed doors, speculate about the intentions of the 12 men, and speculate on the child's potential influence. The servants and townsfolk, while physically present in the estate, understand that they are witnesses to a quiet power struggle, their observations tinged with fear and anticipation. The narrative emphasizes the psychological weight of proximity, living in the shadow of wealth and authority without ever touching it, watching events unfold that are both ordinary and extraordinary, mundane and sinister. Religious and cultural undertones permeate the town, reinforcing the moral tension surrounding the story. Local clergy preach virtue and propriety, while social rituals reinforce hierarchies and obedience. The girl's presence, however, challenges these norms. Her innocence becomes a mirror reflecting the hypocrisy of the adults, the corruption hidden beneath civility, and the fragility of authority. By presenting these contrasts, the narrative builds suspense. The audience begins to sense that the town itself is a character in the story, a silent participant in the unfolding drama, with history and tradition providing both protection and constraint. The section closes with a lingering sense of foreboding. As the girl walks the perimeter of the estate, observing the town through iron gates or along shaded pathways, she is aware of the patterns, the tensions, and the opportunities hidden within the social landscape. Every street corner, every whispering neighbor, and every shadowed window contributes to a sense of anticipation. The audience is left with an impression of a town that is alive, watchful, and poised on the edge of change, much like the girl herself. The subtle balance between power and vulnerability, innocence and corruption, creates a slow-burning tension that perfectly sets the stage for the next phase of the story, where the first cracks in authority will begin to appear. In the days following her arrival, the estate settles into a deceptive routine, but beneath the surface, tension begins to accumulate. The young girl, outwardly compliant, navigates her new environment with the careful precision of someone who understands instinctively that survival requires observation and subtlety. Her every movement is deliberate, a tilt of the head, the way she folds her hands, even the timing of a smile is measured. While the men around her initially perceive only her youth and apparent vulnerability, she quietly begins to map their temperaments, noting patterns in behavior, reactions to stress, and the minor fissures in their carefully maintained authority. The narrative emphasizes her quiet intelligence, a force that contrasts sharply with the unchecked arrogance of the 12 men. Small incidents reveal the early cracks in the men's composure. A game of cards, intended as casual entertainment, becomes a theater for the first signs of psychological imbalance. One man loses his temper over a minor rule, his face flushing with frustration as he lashes out at a servant, only to be met with subtle, knowing glances from the girl that seem almost imperceptible to others but strike at his pride. Another, tasked with overseeing her education, finds his authority undermined by her sharp questions and precocious observations. These moments, seemingly trivial, are described with meticulous attention to sensory detail, the clink of a cup, the shuffle of a chair, the flicker of candlelight across a tense expression, drawing the audience into the subtle yet escalating psychological drama. The narrative shifts seamlessly between the perspectives of the girl and the men, highlighting the growing tension. From her point of view, the estate is a puzzle to be deciphered, the routines, the hidden passages, the unspoken alliances, and the points of vulnerability among her captors. From theirs, she is a source of increasing unease, her calm intelligence and silent observation causing irritation and suspicion. Small acts of defiance, refusing to answer a question in the expected tone, a deliberate pause before obedience, or a fleeting look of recognition at a breach of etiquette, become markers of her agency, subtle yet profoundly destabilizing. Servants and minor witnesses begin to notice these patterns as well. Though they cannot always articulate what they see, the slow change in the household's atmosphere is palpable. Whispers pass from kitchen to hallway, observations that build a tapestry of unease. Even the landscape of the estate, with its long corridors and dimly lit corners, becomes a participant in the tension, amplifying small gestures and fleeting expressions. The narrative paints the estate almost as a living organism, responding to and amplifying the psychological dynamics between the girl and the men. As the days progress, the contrast between innocence and influence becomes more pronounced. She performs the tasks expected of her, maintaining the appearance of compliance, but each action carries the weight of silent calculation. She observes the men in private moments, noticing the cracks in their facade, the moments when arrogance gives way to insecurity. The narrative lingers on these subtle interactions, a careless laugh, a tightened jaw, a hand brushing nervously across a table. These minor cues are imbued with meaning, revealing the slow, almost imperceptible power she begins to wield, even without speaking a single confrontational word. The psychological complexity of the men is explored in this section. Their initial confidence, the assumption that her youth renders her powerless, slowly erodes under the weight of her quiet scrutiny. Some begin to question themselves, their decisions, even their own judgment. One man, previously known for unwavering composure, experiences small yet noticeable lapses, flinching at imagined slights or misinterpreting harmless remarks. Another starts to overcompensate in displays of authority, his actions increasingly desperate and performative. These subtle collapses are depicted with cinematic precision, emphasizing how fragile power can be when confronted by unexpected intelligence and resilience. Local observers, those few who are aware of the estate's inner workings, begin to speculate on the growing tension. Rumors circulate quietly through the town, stories that blend fact and conjecture. The narrative captures the blend of fear, fascination, and moral judgment that accompanies these observations, emphasizing how the girl's influence extends beyond the immediate walls of the estate. Her presence is already reshaping perceptions, planting seeds of doubt and unease among those who are not even directly involved. The narrative also examines the girl's internal state, her strategic patience, and her emotional resilience. While she faces threats to her autonomy and the constant awareness of the men's gaze, she channels fear into observation and planning. Moments of quiet introspection reveal her understanding of the delicate balance between compliance and defiance. The audience sees her mind working through scenarios, testing boundaries, and calculating the minimal moves required to elicit reactions without provoking outright retaliation. This careful interplay establishes her as an active participant in the unfolding drama, a presence that quietly shifts the dynamics of power in ways the men cannot yet comprehend. Moments of indirect challenge begin to escalate. A misstep by one of the men, a slip of etiquette, or a lapse in composure is quietly noted by the girl, whose reactions, subtle smiles, deliberate silences, or piercing glances, intensify the psychological pressure. The estate, with its echoing hallways and dim lighting, becomes a stage for these interactions, magnifying the tension and emphasizing the slow-burning suspense. Each small act of defiance, though imperceptible to most, contributes to a mounting sense of inevitability. The girl is quietly asserting influence, her intelligence and awareness beginning to destabilize the men in ways they cannot fully articulate. By the end of this section, the narrative establishes the pattern that will dominate the next phases of the story. The girl's calculated defiance paired with her ability to remain outwardly compliant creates a constant tension, a slow erosion of authority that promises future upheaval. The audience is drawn into the psychological chess game unfolding within the estate, fully aware of the stakes and the subtle yet powerful shifts in control. The slow escalation of tension, combined with detailed observation and atmospheric description, ensures that every interaction carries weight, setting the stage for the more overt confrontations and unraveling to come. As the girl settles into the estate, the ripples of her presence begin to extend beyond the immediate household, reaching those who occupy the peripheries of power. Servants, who once moved silently in routine, now exchange knowing glances, careful not to draw attention. Even minor gestures, a lowered voice, a hesitant step, a glance exchanged over polished silver, carry significance, as the household begins to feel the subtle destabilization she brings. The narrative dwells on these micro-interactions, magnifying their weight in a world where every observation is a potential threat or advantage. The tension is not yet violent, but it is palpable, a low hum vibrating through hallways, kitchens, and drawing rooms. The first witnesses to the change are the estate servants. Their loyalty is split between fear, duty, and moral curiosity, creating a fragile network of perception that amplifies the girl's quiet influence. A cook might hesitate in serving a meal, watching the girl's composure and realizing that the children's games and routines have been replaced with calculated observation. A footman pauses mid-step, sensing that subtle cues in the men's behavior, twitches of the jaw, tight fists, averted eyes, signal the beginning of cracks in authority. These small, almost imperceptible signs are described in cinematic detail: the clink of cutlery on china, the muted creak of floorboards under careful footsteps, the faint echo of whispered conjecture. Each element reinforces the growing unease that no one dares openly acknowledge. Rumors begin to circulate quietly among the town's observers, fed by servants and minor witnesses who perceive shifts in the household's balance of power. Whispers speak of the girl's uncanny awareness, her ability to anticipate the men's moods and actions, and her subtle manipulation of social dynamics. These murmurs are never loud, never overt, but they spread with the speed of water seeping through cracks in stone, creating a tension that lingers long after the words are spoken. The narrative explores the psychological impact on those who witness these changes. Anxiety, fear, and fascination intertwine, leaving them unsure of how much they understand or how much they might reveal if questioned. The men themselves remain largely unaware of the scale of observation directed at them. Some sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a prickling at the edge of awareness that something has changed, yet cannot identify the source. Their responses range from irritation to self-doubt, moments of frustration amplified by the subtle defiance and observation of the girl. One might become unusually meticulous, checking locks, observing the behaviors of servants, or rehearsing social manners, while another displays nervous repetition, a visible sign of unease that the girl notes and files away in her internal ledger. The narrative lingers on these psychological microcosms, illustrating how power can be undermined not through force, but through perception and awareness. The household becomes a stage for these quiet battles. Long corridors, shadowed alcoves, and expansive rooms allow for glances exchanged, unspoken communication, and strategic observation. The girl moves through the estate like a silent observer, noting alliances and rivalries among the men, subtle gestures of contempt or fear, and the shifting patterns of attention. Each scene is described with cinematic richness: the flicker of candlelight across a tense expression, the muffled sound of a door closing too slowly, or the pause in conversation that hints at a suppressed reaction. The physical space of the estate mirrors the psychological space occupied by tension and suspicion, each reflecting the other in a slow, almost imperceptible dance. As whispers proliferate, the narrative emphasizes the creeping isolation experienced by the men. They find themselves under constant, invisible scrutiny, not only from the girl but from those who observe the unfolding drama from the margins. Anxiety grows, often without conscious recognition, eroding confidence and composure. Small errors, misplaced words, forgotten instructions, misinterpreted gestures, take on outsized significance. The audience witnesses a slow erosion of authority, a dismantling of psychological fortitude that is as quiet as it is relentless. The narrative portrays this erosion with detail: a man's hand trembling while pouring tea, a stifled sigh during a conversation meant to assert dominance, or a sharp, self-conscious glance that betrays insecurity. Religious and social constructs in the estate amplify the tension. The 12 men, accustomed to unquestioned authority, find themselves constrained by expectations of decorum and the perception of public morality. Their attempts to maintain composure, to appear unaffected, are constantly undermined by the girl's quiet observations and the growing awareness among servants and peripheral witnesses. The narrative explores this tension, emphasizing the contrast between public appearance and private turmoil. Even routine religious or ceremonial duties are colored by the unease she generates, each gesture and word measured against an invisible standard set by her awareness. The narrative also highlights the girl's strategic use of silence. She rarely confronts the men directly, understanding that overt defiance would provoke punishment or retaliation. Instead, she cultivates an aura of subtle omnipresence, moving silently through rooms, lingering where attention is least expected, and allowing her gaze to convey understanding, disapproval, or recognition. These silent interventions are described with meticulous attention to psychological effect. A slight raising of an eyebrow, a tilt of the head, or the careful timing of a glance can destabilize even the most composed man. The audience is drawn into the tension, recognizing that the girl's influence grows precisely because it is understated, unnoticed by most, yet profoundly effective. Whispers behind closed doors do not remain confined to the estate. Local townsfolk, observing from a distance, begin to speculate on the causes of tension, their imaginations filling gaps in understanding with rumor and conjecture. These accounts, though partial and often distorted, contribute to a narrative of inevitability. The girl is no longer merely a presence within the estate but a force whose influence extends into the broader social sphere. Even the men, who pride themselves on rationality and control, feel the weight of perception pressing against them, amplifying fear and self-doubt in ways they cannot articulate. The section closes by reinforcing the slow, suffocating spread of tension. The girl, still outwardly compliant and unassuming, has transformed the household into a theater of psychological unease. Servants whisper, men flinch at imagined threats, and the very architecture of the estate, the echoing corridors, shadowed alcoves, and polished surfaces, seems complicit in amplifying every small gesture. The audience is left with a heightened sense of anticipation, fully aware that the subtle power she wields through observation, silence, and psychological acuity will soon escalate into more overt disruption. Every glance, every hushed word, every shadowed corner contributes to the mounting suspense, ensuring that the story's slow-burning tension continues to deepen. As the subtle tension within the estate grows, the 12 men respond in ways that reveal the fragility of their authority. They attempt to reconcile their unease through denial, clinging to routines, rituals, and long-established hierarchies that have always defined their sense of control. Yet the presence of the girl disrupts these patterns in ways they cannot fully understand or manage. She moves through the halls with quiet awareness, observing every expression, every twitch of the jaw, every fleeting gesture, and this observation alone begins to unsettle them. Their initial confidence, rooted in social status and accumulated power, begins to erode, replaced by irritation, doubt, and a creeping paranoia. Many of the men seek refuge in faith, appealing to religious doctrine or moral frameworks as a way to rationalize what they cannot explain. Sermons, prayers, and private reflections are invoked not only to reassure themselves but to project a sense of righteousness over their authority. Yet even these practices feel hollow against the girl's quiet acuity. She listens, observes, and internalizes the contradictions between their words and actions, perceiving the hypocrisy that they themselves ignore. The narrative emphasizes the tension between outward morality and internal weakness, illustrating how easily the veneer of virtue can be fractured by the presence of someone who does not conform to expectations. Social facades, carefully constructed over decades, begin to crumble under her influence. Each man clings to his reputation, aware that any sign of vulnerability could be exploited or observed, yet they fail to anticipate how subtly the girl undermines them. Her obedience is never complete. She answers questions in ways that appear innocent but reveal insight, offers compliance that masks a deeper comprehension of power dynamics, and cultivates the perception of simplicity while quietly analyzing each man's weaknesses. These moments, though understated, carry enormous psychological weight, destabilizing their sense of certainty. The narrative lingers on cinematic details, a stiffened posture as the girl responds, a hand unconsciously tightening around a goblet, a sharp glance exchanged between men who sense unease but cannot name its source. The interplay between fear and denial becomes central to the atmosphere of the estate. Some men choose to ignore signs of disruption, attributing moments of internal unease to fatigue or coincidence. Others attempt to reassert dominance, their actions increasingly rigid and performative, revealing the cracks in their confidence. The girl, perceptive as ever, notes these patterns and allows them to continue, understanding that the more they strive to conceal weakness, the more their behavior will betray them. The narrative highlights this dynamic with precision: the rise and fall of tension in private rooms, the subtle shifting of authority among those who assume themselves untouchable, and the quiet, almost imperceptible ways in which her presence begins to dictate behavior. Faith and moral justification become tools of self-deception. One man may recite prayers to bolster courage, yet falter when the girl's gaze lingers too long. Another may invoke propriety or social norms to mask the disquiet he feels in her presence. The narrative captures these contradictions with careful detail, emphasizing the psychological complexity of power confronted by intelligence and subtle defiance. The contrast between outward displays of piety and internal agitation deepens the suspense, highlighting how even the most disciplined or morally confident individuals can be destabilized by an unexpected challenge. Servants and observers notice these shifts with growing fascination and fear. They perceive the men's increasing unease, their overcompensation, and their moments of hesitation, yet few understand the full scope of what is occurring. The narrative illustrates how perception itself becomes a weapon, with the girl's silent observation amplified by the eyes of those who move quietly through the estate. Whispers circulate, rumors take shape, and even minor missteps are noted and discussed in hushed tones, feeding the tension that the girl cultivates without deliberate effort. Every glance, every pause, every unspoken reaction contributes to the slow, inevitable erosion of authority within the household. The section explores the emotional and moral complexity of the girl herself. She witnesses the reliance on faith and the performance of morality, understanding that these constructs offer both strength and vulnerability to those around her. While she is still young, her perception is keen, and she recognizes the contradictions between appearance and reality, obedience and manipulation. Her own moral compass is not yet fully defined, but the narrative emphasizes her growing awareness of how power, belief, and deception intertwine, providing her with the tools to subtly influence and destabilize the men over time. Psychologically, the estate becomes a crucible of tension and contradiction. The men's insistence on maintaining moral facades and rational explanations creates pressure that intensifies under the girl's quiet scrutiny. The narrative captures the claustrophobic atmosphere of these psychological dynamics: the echo of footsteps in long hallways, the muffled conversations behind closed doors, the flicker of candlelight casting shadows that seem to exaggerate every micro-expression. The audience is drawn into the slow-burning suspense, sensing the growing inevitability of a confrontation that is less physical than it is emotional and psychological. The narrative closes this section with an emphasis on the precarious balance between denial and recognition. The men are caught between the need to maintain authority, the desire to interpret events through faith and morality, and the unacknowledged awareness of the girl's presence and subtle influence. The estate itself seems complicit, every corner, shadow, and reflection amplifying the tension. The audience is left with a profound sense of anticipation, understanding that the fragile equilibrium cannot endure indefinitely. Small gestures, silent observations, and private moments of doubt are quietly shaping the path toward the eventual unraveling of power, ensuring that the story continues to build toward the dramatic escalation that lies ahead. The fragile equilibrium of the estate finally begins to fracture in ways that are impossible to ignore. The subtle tension that has been quietly building over weeks and months erupts into a series of incidents that expose the psychological vulnerabilities of the 12 men. The narrative shifts to a more intense, almost suffocating focus on the household's internal dynamics, portraying how a single presence, a child whose outward innocence masks extraordinary perceptiveness, can destabilize an entire network of power. Every movement, every glance, every gesture within the estate becomes laden with significance, the men's composed facades giving way to cracks that are increasingly visible to all who observe. The first signs of overt unraveling appear in the form of minor confrontations, initially dismissed as coincidence or temperament. A conversation over dinner spirals unexpectedly, a comment misinterpreted, a slight smile taken as mockery. One man slams his hand against the table in frustration, only to be caught in a fleeting moment of self-consciousness as he realizes the girl has observed his loss of control. Another, previously confident in his ability to dominate conversation and dictate events, falters mid-sentence, hesitating under the unyielding weight of her gaze. These incidents, though seemingly trivial, are depicted in painstaking detail: the clatter of silverware, the shifting shadows of candlelight across taut faces, the barely perceptible intake of breath by a servant who senses that authority is eroding before her eyes. The narrative highlights the girl's quiet mastery of observation and strategy. She does not act with overt aggression, she does not confront, challenge, or provoke in ways that would invite direct reprisal. Instead, she cultivates an awareness so acute that she anticipates actions, notes weaknesses, and positions herself to exploit small vulnerabilities as they appear. Her intelligence is expressed in subtle gestures, the timing of a question, the calmness of her movements, the faint, knowing expressions she allows to escape. In doing so, she transforms the estate into a theater where psychological power, rather than physical force, dominates. The audience is drawn into this slow-burn tension, recognizing the potency of influence wielded silently, almost invisibly. The men begin to show signs of internal conflict and fragmentation. Their previous cohesion, built upon shared status, authority, and privilege, begins to splinter under the pressure of her quiet disruption. Rivalries that were previously latent surface, alliances fracture over minor disagreements, and long-standing habits of mutual reinforcement fail. The narrative captures the microdynamics of these fractures: a whispered aside during a meal, a sharp glance across a room, a sudden, unexplained change in tone. These small moments are imbued with outsized consequence, each one feeding the growing anxiety, paranoia, and frustration that dominate the household. Escalation continues as the girl's presence becomes increasingly central to the men's psychological disarray. Minor accidents, overlooked details, or forgotten instructions are interpreted as deliberate slights or signs of weakness. One man begins to question his own memory, recalling events differently than others, while another obsessively monitors the movements of both servants and peers, attempting to reclaim control in ways that are ultimately futile. The narrative portrays these collapses with meticulous attention to sensory detail: the way a door creaks under the weight of a hesitant hand, the flickering shadows of chandeliers exaggerating tension, the subtle tremor of a hand reaching for a goblet of wine. These cinematic elements intensify the audience's awareness of the slow yet inevitable disintegration of authority. The estate itself becomes a character in the narrative, reflecting the instability of those who inhabit it. Long, echoing corridors magnify the smallest sounds, while shadowed corners provide both concealment and a constant sense of surveillance. The furniture, polished to a reflective sheen, mirrors not only the images of the men but also their growing anxiety and self-consciousness. Even the natural elements, wind rustling through distant trees, the faint creak of branches against windows, are described in ways that heighten suspense and underscore the fragility of power. Every detail reinforces the impression that the household is no longer controlled by the 12 men but is subtly being influenced and observed by a figure who, despite her age, commands authority through awareness and patience. The narrative examines the psychological toll on each man in increasing depth. One, previously regarded as calm and composed, develops a nervous habit of adjusting his coat repeatedly, a physical manifestation of internal chaos. Another begins to speak in clipped, measured sentences, conscious that even a single misstep could be noticed and exploited. A third isolates himself, withdrawing from conversation and avoiding the girl's gaze, only to become more erratic in private. Each portrait is drawn with cinematic attention to both physical expression and emotional resonance, allowing the audience to experience the slow-burning tension in a visceral, almost claustrophobic way. Local observers, those few with awareness of the estate's internal dynamics, note subtle shifts with a mix of awe and dread. Servants whisper about unusual reactions, minor mishaps, and unexplained tensions, while townspeople speculate about the growing disarray. These accounts, though incomplete and filtered through rumor, contribute to the sense that the girl's influence extends beyond the estate's walls. Even without overt confrontation, she reshapes the social landscape through perception, observation, and the careful manipulation of micro-interactions, leaving the audience with an understanding of her quiet yet profound power. Amidst this unraveling, the narrative explores the girl's internal experience. She remains outwardly composed, aware of the psychological impact she has wrought without needing to assert dominance overtly. Moments of introspection reveal her understanding of human behavior, the delicate interplay of fear, pride, and perception, and the ways in which she can use these elements to maintain an advantage. Her resilience, patience, and strategic intelligence emerge as defining characteristics, framing her not as a victim of circumstance but as a force quietly reshaping the environment around her. The climax of this section approaches as incidents of psychological disarray intensify. Conflicts that were once contained within minor disagreements escalate into tense arguments, abrupt withdrawals, and moments of visible panic. Authority is no longer assumed but constantly contested, the men struggling to maintain composure under scrutiny that is both overt and invisible. The narrative emphasizes the cinematic tension of these moments, a slammed door echoing through the hallways, a sharp intake of breath in response to a seemingly innocuous question, the interplay of light and shadow amplifying every minor movement. These elements combine to immerse the audience fully in the emotional and psychological collapse taking shape. By the end of this section, the slow, deliberate unraveling has reached a critical point. The 12 men, once confident in their unassailable authority, are now visibly destabilized, their cohesion fractured, their composure eroded. The girl's silent observation and subtle manipulation have transformed the estate into a theater of psychological power, where influence is wielded without force, and control is measured not by strength but by perception. The audience is left with a profound sense of anticipation, aware that the next phases of the story will move from quiet destabilization to overt confrontation and further collapse. The tension, meticulously cultivated over preceding sections, now reaches a point of near inevitability, setting the stage for the dramatic climax to come. This section delves deeply into the hidden and convoluted history behind the 12 men's decision to acquire the girl, tracing the origins of their pact back decades before she even existed. The narrative opens with faded letters and brittle ledgers discovered in a long-forgotten study of one of the men's estates, their inked words hinting at secrecy, ambition, and fear of exposure. The girl's presence was never intended to be maternal or nurturing, she was a symbol, an unspoken instrument in a delicate, morally corrupt equilibrium that the men had meticulously cultivated. Each man had personal stakes, intertwined with political influence, inherited wealth, and unrecorded crimes, and her acquisition was meant to ensure obedience, silence, and the preservation of their collective power. The story describes these agreements in almost ritualistic detail, including clandestine gatherings where gestures, cryptic phrases, and small tokens acted as codes understood only by the 12. As the section unfolds, the girl herself becomes aware of the undercurrents surrounding her. She observes the men exchanging letters under the table, overhearing conversations in low murmurs that reveal their anxieties, rivalries, and unacknowledged fears. Though outwardly calm and obedient, she begins cataloging every nuance, who avoids eye contact with whom, who shows a flicker of dread when certain topics arise, who subtly betrays guilt. This meticulous observation is presented in the narrative as both eerie and profoundly intelligent. The audience is made to see that she is quietly converting their concealed agreements into her own invisible ledger of power. The section also introduces perspectives from townspeople and secondary witnesses, maids, servants, and occasional tradesmen, who have glimpsed parts of these interactions. Their recollections, sometimes contradictory and often fragmentary, create an unsettling patchwork of the men's dominance and the child's silent surveillance. These anecdotes underscore a growing sense that the house in which she is raised is a stage, every gesture calculated, every whispered word a possible trigger for the unraveling that is to come. In addition, the narrative explores the subtle ways in which the agreements affected the girl's upbringing. She was deliberately shielded from conventional socialization, prevented from forming attachments outside the observation of the 12 men, and exposed to specific historical and philosophical teachings that molded her reasoning and perception. The section describes how her education was both rigorous and isolating, designed to cultivate intelligence, patience, and an almost preternatural understanding of human behavior. She learns patterns, anticipates reactions, and internalizes the moral hypocrisies that underpin the men's power, all without direct confrontation. As the story progresses, small cracks in the system emerge. One of the men begins questioning the original pact, realizing that secrecy and control are not absolute. Conflicts among the men intensify, and minor betrayals are recorded in the girl's silent memory. The narrative builds tension by demonstrating how the house itself becomes a repository for the invisible ledger of both the men's sins and her comprehension. By the end of the section, the audience sees a full picture of the men's hubris. They believed themselves untouchable, masters of both law and human manipulation, yet they were unwittingly shaping the very force that would dismantle them. The section closes on an ominous note, emphasizing that their agreements, once thought secure, are now fragile, transparent to the child whose intellect and perception have grown in quiet parallel to their secrets, and setting the stage for the inevitable unraveling that will follow in subsequent sections. This section captures the climactic evening when the carefully maintained balance among the 12 men collapses completely. The narrative begins with the approach of a violent storm, which the town's weather records later describe as sudden and unseasonable. Thunder rumbles like a warning, winds howl through the streets, and the rain pounds against windows with a relentless, almost accusatory force. The storm isolates the town, cutting off telegraph lines, flooding roads, and knocking out power in the estates of the 12 men. The atmosphere is heavy with anticipation, and the audience is immediately drawn into a sense of claustrophobic tension, as if the natural world itself conspires to mirror the psychological and moral rupture about to unfold. The story then shifts focus to the men individually. One by one, they begin to crack under the pressure of the storm and their own accumulated fears. A man who has long relied on intimidation and manipulation finds himself unable to sleep, pacing the halls of his estate while imagining the girl's gaze on him in every darkened corner. Another confronts a trusted associate, accusing him of betrayal based on an imagined slight remembered from decades earlier. The narrative emphasizes the psychological unraveling, portraying each breakdown with careful attention to emotional nuance rather than sensationalized action. Their dialogue is fragmented, tinged with desperation, and occasionally nonsensical, revealing how quickly their control has dissolved. The girl moves silently through the chaos, observing every reaction, every tremor of fear, and every attempt to assert dominance that now rings hollow. She remains outwardly calm, almost detached, as if she understands the storm is both literal and metaphorical, reflecting the cumulative weight of decades of secrecy, guilt, and moral corruption. Her presence is a silent commentary, a living ledger of their hidden misdeeds, and the narrative underscores the contrast between her composed intellect and the men's disintegration. Moments of eerie stillness punctuate the storm, a candle flickers as she enters a room, a window shatters without wind, a clock stops at a precise, meaningful time, details that heighten suspense while maintaining realism, leaving the audience questioning whether these are natural occurrences, coincidence, or the subtle power of the girl herself. As the evening progresses, confrontations escalate. Several men attempt to flee, only to be blocked by rising floodwaters or the sheer isolation of the storm, forcing them back into the shared space of their anxiety. Accusations fly, alliances collapse, and long-suppressed grievances surface in public and private outbursts. Secrets once buried under layers of wealth and influence are revealed in unguarded moments, financial fraud, past betrayals, and personal betrayals that were never meant to see the light of day. The narrative emphasizes the irony that the storm exposes the human frailty the men spent years concealing. Nature and circumstance combine to strip away the veneer of invincibility. Throughout the night, the town itself reacts subtly. Streetlights flicker as if echoing the men's panic. Windows rattle, and shadows cast by the storm make ordinary streets seem unfamiliar and threatening. Servants and townspeople, though mostly observing from a distance, note the tension radiating from the estates. Their recollections, often fragmented, create a layered narrative that blends collective memory with the eerie personal experiences of the men themselves. The audience is given the impression that the town is an unintentional witness to a psychological catastrophe as precise and devastating as any physical disaster. By the end of the night, the storm begins to abate, but the damage has been done. Some of the men are dead, having succumbed to panic, heart attacks, or accidents that seem almost fated. Others are left physically unharmed but irrevocably broken, stripped of authority, credibility, and peace of mind. The girl emerges as the silent pivot of the narrative, unchanged in appearance yet undeniably altered in agency. Her observations have translated into power, shaping events through her mere presence. The section closes with a haunting emphasis on duality. The storm recedes, but its consequences linger, and the town awakens to a reality forever altered. The audience is left suspended between awe, fear, and an uneasy understanding that the unraveling was not simply a result of nature but of the moral and psychological debts the 12 men had accumulated over a lifetime, debts now claimed in full by the precision and patience of the child they once sought to control. This section captures the eerie, disquieting aftermath of the storm and the unraveling of the 12 men, focusing on the town's first glimpses of the consequences. At sunrise, the storm has passed, leaving the streets slick with rain and debris, broken branches scattered like reminders of the chaos that unfolded. The air is thick with silence, almost unnatural in its stillness, as if the town itself is holding its breath. Windows of the estates once bustling with power now reflect a grim emptiness. Doors hang ajar, revealing interiors in disarray, overturned furniture, scattered papers, and signs of hurried, desperate movement. The audience is immediately struck by the visual contrast between the calm dawn and the psychological storm that had occurred hours earlier. The narrative introduces the townspeople cautiously stepping into the streets, their movements hesitant, scanning the remnants of the storm and the estate grounds for signs of life or explanation. Some come across the bodies of the men who perished, faces frozen in terror or agony, hands clutching remnants of what had once symbolized control. Others discover the survivors, pallid, trembling, unable to articulate the full scope of the night's events. Observers note subtle details, footprints leading to nowhere, rooms locked from the inside, and the girl sitting silently in a courtyard, untouched by wind or rain, as if impervious to the chaos surrounding her. Her calm demeanor contrasts starkly with the ruin around her, intensifying the sense that she is the pivot of the entire narrative, the silent orchestrator in a drama no one else fully comprehends. The section examines the town's collective reaction in psychological depth. Fear mixes with curiosity, whispers begin to circulate about the girl's role in the men's downfall. Some townspeople view her as an innocent child caught in circumstances beyond her control, while others regard her as a harbinger of retribution, a force that mirrored or exacted justice for the transgressions of the powerful. These conflicting interpretations underscore the story's moral ambiguity and leave the audience questioning the nature of causality and accountability. The narrative emphasizes that truth is elusive. What the town sees is both literal and symbolic, reflecting the interplay between human perception and the unseen forces that shape events. The documentation and immediate aftermath of the event also come into focus. Local authorities, overwhelmed by the scale of the psychological breakdown, attempt to impose order, calling for investigations, cataloging deaths, and securing the estates. Yet bureaucratic processes clash with the chaotic reality, some evidence is lost, some testimonies are contradictory, and some details are deliberately concealed. The town's newspapers report on the storm and subsequent deaths with a mixture of sensationalism and caution, framing the events as misfortune or natural disaster, while subtle undertones hint at deeper, more sinister causes. The summary draws attention to how stories are filtered, edited, and reframed, leaving gaps in understanding that the girl's presence seems to fill silently. Subtle observations of nature and environment reinforce the unsettling tone. Birds avoid certain streets, water in the rivers appears unusually dark, and shadows cast by the morning sun exaggerate ordinary features of buildings and trees, giving them an almost sentient presence. The narrative frames these details as psychological mirrors. The environment reflects the moral and emotional disturbance of the night before, reinforcing the idea that the town is a witness, an unwilling participant in a moral reckoning it does not fully comprehend. As the day progresses, townspeople cautiously explore the estates, discovering the accumulated evidence of the men's corrupt practices, ledgers filled with hidden debts, letters exposing manipulation, and artifacts symbolizing control over both the town and each other. The girl remains present but passive, her expression unreadable, embodying a silent witness who has absorbed more than anyone else. Her gaze meets those who approach, leaving an indelible impression of awareness, judgment, and quiet power. This tension between innocence and influence permeates the narrative, emphasizing the emotional weight carried by both the girl and the observers. The section closes with an unsettling duality. The storm is gone, the sun shines on a town slowly emerging from fear, yet a lingering unease remains. People talk in hushed tones about what transpired, while rumors proliferate, each account shifting slightly with retelling. The girl eventually disappears from immediate view, moving into the shadows of the town, her presence felt but rarely seen. By the end of the section, the audience is left with the impression that while the immediate chaos has passed, the ramifications of that night, the psychological collapse of the 12 men, the silent force of the girl, and the town's awareness of moral fragility, will echo for decades. The narrative emphasizes that some truths cannot be fully articulated, they are instead observed, felt, and remembered, leaving a residue of awe, fear, and unresolved questioning that defines the town's collective consciousness. This section explores the long-term consequences of the events that unfolded during the storm and the unraveling of the 12 men, focusing on how the town, surrounding regions, and historical records grapple with the truth. The narrative begins with the immediate weeks following the night of chaos. Investigators arrive, both official and unofficial, but find themselves stymied by the absence of clear evidence, the deliberate obfuscation of the men's past dealings, and the girl's sudden disappearance. Documents are scattered, destroyed, or mysteriously missing, letters vanish, ledgers are smudged or illegible. Townspeople, who had borne witness to fragments of the events, are reluctant to speak openly, either from fear or a sense that some things are too terrible, too delicate, to recount. This silence becomes the first layer of the legacy, an invisible barrier between history and the truth. As the narrative expands, the story traces the girl's absence and the conflicting accounts of her fate. Some reports suggest she was taken by distant relatives, placed in anonymity to protect her from curiosity and exploitation. Others hint she may have remained nearby, her presence unrecorded but subtly influencing events, guiding or averting outcomes without recognition. These ambiguities are emphasized to maintain tension and leave the audience in a state of reflection. The girl, once a passive observer, has now become a symbol of retribution, of moral balance, and of the consequences of power abused. Her invisibility reinforces the emotional weight of her legacy, suggesting that influence need not be overt to be absolute. The section also examines the cultural and psychological imprint left on the town. Children growing up hear hushed versions of the story in classrooms, church basements, and whispered among laborers during night shifts. Legends form, the girl becomes both a cautionary figure and an almost supernatural enigma. Adults remember the precise moment the storm cleared, recalling the eerie stillness, the bodies of the men, and the unsettling calm of the girl in the courtyard. Over time, these memories evolve into folklore, blending fact with speculation, yet always retaining the chilling undertone that some forces, human or otherwise, cannot be controlled or contained. Local institutions, from churches to municipal offices, attempt to sanitize or suppress elements of the story. Records are sealed, and certain deaths are attributed to natural causes or misfortune. Historians later uncover fragments, piecing together evidence that challenges the official narrative, yet gaps remain. This ongoing tension between documentation and memory reinforces a central theme: the truth, while powerful, is rarely complete, and moral reckoning often transcends bureaucratic control. The girl's influence, in this sense, continues to ripple outward through absence as much as presence, leaving a silent, pervasive effect on both individuals and the collective consciousness of the town. The narrative emphasizes psychological complexity, portraying the townspeople as living under an unspoken awareness that balance has shifted. Families who have been loyal to the 12 men now navigate a town where power is no longer absolute, and whispers of the girl's involvement shape decisions, behavior, and social dynamics. The story examines this tension with precision: who speaks, who hides, who remembers, and who reconstructs history in their own favor. These nuances create a layered tapestry of cause and effect, highlighting the subtle but profound ways the girl's existence, and the men's downfall, reshaped the town's moral and social architecture. Finally, the section concludes with reflection on broader implications. The girl becomes a metaphorical force, a representation of how accountability manifests in human systems when power is abused. The men's collapse and the town's uneasy reconciliation with events reveal the fragility of human constructs. Authority, secrecy, and perceived invincibility are ultimately vulnerable to observation, truth, and silent intelligence. The story ends on a lingering, reflective note: decades later, no one can say with certainty where she went, what she became, or whether her influence has ended. The narrative leaves the audience with an emotional resonance that is both unsettling and awe-inspiring, underscoring the enduring power of a child who was bought as an object but became an agent of irreversible moral reckoning. This concluding section reflects on the unresolved mysteries surrounding the girl and the collapse of the 12 men, leaving the audience with a haunting sense of ambiguity and moral contemplation. The narrative begins with the present-day town, decades after the events, where buildings bear subtle scars of history and the landscape has quieted, yet whispers of that night continue to ripple through local consciousness. Residents speak of the girl in hushed tones, sometimes as a cautionary tale, sometimes as a figure of almost mythic intelligence, and yet no one can provide definitive answers about her origin, her actions, or her fate. The story emphasizes how memory, rumor, and incomplete records have intertwined to create a legacy both chilling and morally instructive. The section examines attempts by historians, journalists, and folklorists to reconstruct the events, each effort frustrated by contradictory accounts and missing evidence. Diaries of the surviving men, once thought authoritative, reveal gaps, inconsistencies, and subtle omissions that suggest fear, guilt, and perhaps even shame shaped their records. Witness testimonies, collected years later, often conflict with one another, reflecting the unreliability of human memory and the psychological imprint of trauma on observation. The narrative underscores the tension between what can be proven and what can only be inferred, leaving the audience to grapple with the interplay of fact, perception, and interpretation. The girl herself becomes the focal point of this ambiguity. Accounts describe her as simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary, a child capable of absorbing the smallest details, the quietest truths, and the hidden moral failings of those around her. Yet her methods remain unknowable, her motivations inscrutable. Did she act consciously to dismantle the 12 men, or were the events the inevitable result of their own corruption? Did she possess insight beyond her years, or did her presence merely illuminate flaws that existed long before she arrived? The narrative carefully frames these questions without answering them, emphasizing the subtle horror of uncertainty. The most powerful consequences often arise from forces we cannot see or control. The section also explores the town's cultural memory, showing how generations have internalized the story. Children are taught to respect caution and intelligence, elders speak in metaphors when recounting the girl's influence, and even the physical spaces, empty estates, overgrown gardens, abandoned rooms, act as reminders of events that defy explanation. The story presents these memories as living entities, influencing behavior, shaping social dynamics, and creating a moral framework for the town without ever fully revealing its truths. The lingering presence of the girl becomes an invisible agent of reflection and ethical awareness, a force whose impact transcends visibility or direct action. Symbolism is heavily emphasized. The storm that preceded the unraveling, the empty estates, and the silent observation of the girl are interwoven into the narrative as metaphors for unseen power, moral reckoning, and the fragility of human constructs. The audience is invited to contemplate broader philosophical questions. How much control do we truly have over systems of power? How does innocence intersect with justice? Can silence itself become a tool for transformation? Each unanswered question reinforces the emotional resonance of the story, leaving viewers with a sense of both awe and unease. In the closing moments, the narrative revisits the central duality of innocence versus corruption, knowledge versus ignorance, and patience versus hubris. The girl, once perceived as powerless, is revealed through the town's fragmented recollections to have exerted influence in ways that were subtle yet irreversible. The 12 men, despite wealth, social standing, and intricate agreements, were unable to foresee the consequences of their own moral failings. The story leaves the audience suspended in reflection. No definitive resolution exists, no final explanation can be confirmed, yet the echoes of what transpired remain potent, shaping thought, behavior, and moral imagination. The section concludes on an eerie, contemplative note. Shadows linger in the town streets, archives hold partial truths, and the girl's legacy, whether human, symbolic, or something beyond comprehension, persists. The audience is left with the unsettling recognition that some forces, once set in motion, cannot be contained, controlled, or fully understood. This lingering ambiguity ensures the story remains with viewers long after it ends, a slow-burning testament to the enduring power of observation, morality, and the unpredictable consequences of human action. This final section expands the story into a deep meditation on legacy, memory, and the enduring consequences of moral reckoning, tracing decades after the unraveling of the 12 men. The town, outwardly returned to the routine rhythms of daily life, bears quiet yet unmistakable scars of what transpired that stormy night. Streets are subtly warped by time and neglect, buildings bear faint traces of damage, such as cracked windows that were never replaced, doorframes slightly misaligned from years of settling, and walls that still whisper secrets to those who know where to listen. Courtyards overgrown with weeds and abandoned estates serve as silent witnesses, their emptiness a testament to the moral collapse that once occurred within their walls. Even the landscape, the river that runs sluggishly through the town, the uneven hills, and the windswept forests, carries the psychological weight of events that the town collectively refuses to speak aloud. Residents walk these streets with a subconscious awareness that their history is marked by more than natural disasters or political shifts. Older generations recall moments of unease, the nights when shadows seemed deeper and footsteps felt closer than they should have, the peculiar stillness that fell over the town in the aftermath of the storm. Children, growing up hearing hushed tales of the girl who saw everything, internalize lessons of caution, vigilance, and respect for forces beyond comprehension. Adults speak of her in metaphoric terms, sometimes as a figure of justice, sometimes as a ghostly observer whose silence was more powerful than any action. This narrative layer establishes her as both a literal and symbolic agent of change, present in memory, absent from view, yet undeniably shaping the moral and social consciousness of the town. The myths and folklore surrounding the girl evolve over time, blending fragments of truth with imagination. She becomes a character in bedtime stories, a cautionary figure warning children of the consequences of cruelty, dishonesty, or ambition untempered by conscience. Tradesmen whisper about the child who remembers everything as they recount eerie coincidences in daily life. Clergy reference her presence indirectly, drawing moral lessons from the collapse of the 12 men while carefully avoiding explicit mention of her existence. These stories transform her into a symbol, a force whose influence extends beyond the temporal boundaries of the events themselves. The narrative emphasizes how folklore, memory, and human imagination work together to preserve, interpret, and sometimes distort truth, creating layers of meaning that continue to affect behavior and social norms. The girl's absence is as significant as her presence. While she disappears from public view, her influence remains tangible. Some townspeople claim to have seen fleeting glimpses of her in shadows or at the periphery of their vision, though no one can confirm these sightings. Others speak of her in abstract terms, attributing unexplainable events, decisions that corrected injustice, sudden reconciliations, or timely warnings, to her unseen guidance. Her agency is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly effective, demonstrating that power does not always require action to exist. Observation, patience, and understanding can exert force in ways that are unseen but transformative. This duality, her invisibility and omnipresence, reinforces the story's core themes of moral reckoning, the consequences of hubris, and the enduring impact of intellect and patience in shaping human outcomes. The narrative also explores the scholarly attempts to reconstruct the events. Historians, journalists, and folklorists sift through archives, personal diaries, and public records, attempting to create a coherent timeline of the storm, the men's downfall, and the girl's role. Yet every effort is thwarted by contradictions, missing documents, and testimonies that conflict with one another. Some ledgers are deliberately smudged or torn, letters vanish inexplicably, official reports sanitize deaths and attribute calamity to natural causes. The story emphasizes the frustration inherent in seeking clarity from incomplete or manipulated records. These attempts, however, also underscore the human desire for closure, order, and moral comprehension, and highlight the tension between objective truth and the subjective understanding shaped by memory, interpretation, and cultural bias. The psychological impact on the town's residents is profound. Families of the men who survived live with the knowledge that wealth, status, and influence could not shield them from moral consequences. Workers, children, and neighbors internalize the story in ways that shape social dynamics, unspoken codes of behavior, heightened awareness of the repercussions of deceit, and the quiet observation of actions within the community. The narrative emphasizes that the girl's influence extends far beyond the events of that night, becoming an enduring force in the town's ethical framework. Her silent observation has instilled a kind of communal conscience, where memory serves both as caution and as a record of unacknowledged justice. The narrative deepens the exploration of the girl's character as both historical figure and symbolic force. Once bought as a commodity, trained under rigid surveillance, and raised in isolation, she transformed perceived weakness into extraordinary influence. Her intelligence, patience, and observational acuity allowed her to understand the men's patterns, vulnerabilities, and moral failings long before they were fully revealed to others. She absorbed every detail, the gestures, the subtle shifts in tone, the hidden anxieties, and translated them into a form of quiet but absolute authority. The story emphasizes the irony that the system designed to control her, the wealth, secrecy, and agreements of the 12 men, ultimately provided the framework through which she exerted her enduring power. The broader philosophical and ethical implications of her legacy are examined in detail. Her story raises questions about the nature of justice, the limits of human control, and the ways in which moral responsibility can manifest across time. Did she act consciously to dismantle the 12 men, or did she simply observe while their accumulated corruption inevitably led to collapse? Could her influence be understood as a natural consequence of virtue confronting vice, or was it a deliberate orchestration that transcended ordinary comprehension? The narrative leaves these questions unresolved, emphasizing the emotional and intellectual tension inherent in ambiguity, and inviting the audience to grapple with the moral and psychological complexity of the story. The section also considers the town as a living repository of memory and reflection. Empty estates, overgrown gardens, and abandoned corridors serve as silent reminders of human hubris and the consequences of moral neglect. Shadows linger in familiar streets, quiet corners of the town retain echoes of the conversations, fears, and observations that once shaped events. Residents speak in careful tones, and behaviors are subtly guided by the knowledge that power is ephemeral and that accountability can arrive in forms both visible and invisible. The town itself becomes a character in the story, a vessel that holds collective memory, moral lessons, and unspoken reverence for the unseen force that shaped its history. In the final layers of reflection, the narrative emphasizes that the girl's legacy is inseparable from the town's consciousness. She has become a moral lens through which actions are measured, choices are evaluated, and social norms are understood. Her presence, though invisible, informs decisions, tempers ambition, and preserves ethical boundaries. The narrative portrays this influence not as coercion but as a subtle, persistent force, a reminder that human behavior is always observed, measured, and remembered, whether or not the observer is physically present. The story concludes by circling back to the central theme, the interplay between innocence, power, observation, and moral reckoning. The girl, bought as an object, becomes an agent of irreversible change. The 12 men, despite wealth, influence, and complex agreements, fall victim to the consequences of their own corruption. The town, forever marked by memory and reflection, bears witness to events that cannot be fully articulated or comprehended, yet resonate across generations. The narrative closes on a haunting, contemplative tone. The storm has long passed, the men are gone, yet the echoes of their downfall and the silent, profound influence of the girl continue to ripple through time. The audience is left with an emotional afterimage of awe, fear, and contemplation. The girl's story reminds viewers that some forces, subtle yet extraordinary, can shape destinies far beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. Her legacy persists in whispers, shadows, and ethical awareness, a slow-burning testament to patience, observation, and moral reckoning. The narrative concludes with the recognition that some echoes never fade, that some truths resist containment, and that the moral universe, like the girl herself, can act with precision, quiet authority, and lasting consequence. The story lingers in the mind, leaving the audience to ponder the nature of justice, accountability, and human behavior, as well as the enduring power of those who, through intellect, patience, and observation, can alter the course of events without a single overt action. The narrative achieves a slow-burning, emotionally resonant closure, emphasizing that some legacies are invisible yet indelible, subtle yet irrevocable, and that the most profound influence often resides in silence, observation, and moral clarity.